right now, they're signaling me. I do see Ralph on the left side of me. So, consumer advocate and presidential candidate for the last, well, 2000 was the Green Party, 96 was the Green Party, 2004 was as an independent, and under the independent this time, Mr. Ralph Nader.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, by now, I'm sure you're aware of why Nader Gonzalez campaign is going around the country. I was talking with a leading business columnist for the New York Times yesterday. This is a columnist I always read. Floyd Norris is his name. He's very good. And after our discussion about a speculation tax to pay for the bailout, let the speculators pay for their own bailout, he said to me, I've got to ask you a question. I said, what? He said, why are you running? Can you imagine that? I could have said, because I read the New York Times that reports all the injustices and the crimes of corporations and all these things, and the lack of health care and the lack of living wage and so on. So by this time, with the Chris Dodd passed bailout, we know that the degradation of our democratic processes has hit a new low historically. There used to be a time when Congress would stand up to a president. Forget that. King George IV is in charge. There used to be a time when Congress would never bail out a corrupt industry or a mismanaged industry on the backs of the taxpayers. Forget that. They've been doing it for years. There used to be a time when Congress would not bail out a company like Chrysler without thorough public hearings, so all viewpoints could be heard. Forget that. They just bailed out the auto industry with $25 billion in low-interest loans without a single minute of public hearings. They bailed out Wall Street with $700 billion, although I don't think that's going to work, and there wasn't a single day of public hearings. All you saw on TV were the senators and representatives questioning Bush's officials, Secretary of the Treasury, Federal Reserve. That is not the public hearing. The public hearing is letting in the public, the best minds, the representatives of the people who are going to pay the bill, speaking for taxpayers, workers, consumers. And what we have is a Dodd-Frank window-dressed bill that ballooned from 3.5 pages when Bush sent it to over 400. And in those 400 pages, you have deception and cover-up, and you have freebies for all the special interests. I know there's been much said about some tax break for Puerto Rican rum producers, but what most people didn't know, there was a multi-billion-dollar gift to Microsoft called the tax credit. Microsoft, one of the most profitable corporations in the country, along with Cisco, along with Intel, got checks from the Treasury called tax credits. $150 billion they put in, added to the $700 billion bailout. Well, here's the analysis of it. One, it's not going to work. What's the second act? Well, let's ask why it isn't going to work. It's not going to work because it's directed in the wrong area. It is going to be directed to bailing out the most reckless, the most risk-taking speculators in Wall Street. By my view, that isn't where you should start. You should start first with preventing and averting homeowner foreclosures and defaults. There's almost nothing, according to the New York Times, in that 400-page bill for those people. The second you would support are the prudent savers and the prudent banks who were exposed, not due to their own behavior, to these economic and financial risks by Wall Street, by Wall Street's orgy of excess, as the Federal Reserve official in Dallas actually said the other day. And that's where you go. Instead, they're going to their buddies in Wall Street. Well, the Secretary of Treasury was the head of Goldman Sachs, cashed out 2 years ago for $500 million. Now he's Secretary of Treasury. He's going to bail out his buddies in Wall Street. It's really quite interesting. It reminds me of my father when years ago, around the dinner table, he asked the question, why would capitalism always survive? And we said, you tell us, Dad. And he said, because capitalism will always make socialism save it. And that's what Wall Street is doing to Washington. We have now reached a point in our society where we're entitled to get angry, we're entitled to break our routine, we're entitled to mobilize ourselves, and we're entitled to stop making excuses for ourselves that we don't have any power, and the big boys are going to make the decisions for us and our children. We've gone in about 220 years from 13 colonies under King George III to 50 colonies under King George IV. We have taxation without representation. That was the first complaint of our revolutionaries against King George. If this bailout is anything, it's taxation without representation, without consultation, without even having the decency for members of Congress to take a couple days off and go back home and hear what's on people's minds. And you know why they didn't do that. It's because they know they will reach a torrent of anger by people, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, anarchists, Green Party advocates, or supporters of Nader Gonzalez. Instead, they shut the doors, they met in private with the corporate lobbies and with Bush's lobbyists, and they cut this deal. And now Senator Dodd will come back and say they exhibited profiles and courage. Now you have a congressman here who should be defeated. Chris Murphy is a dynamic fraud. He lied to the people in this session. He lied to the people when he said, elect me and I'll show you how to get out of Iraq. And elect me and I'll show you what civil liberties are like. And elect me and elect me. And all he did, because of his consummate ambition in the House of Representatives, is become a predictable toady to Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, his superiors in the House of Representatives. He is now viewed by the House leadership as their pet puppy from Connecticut. That's who's representing you. And you should give some recognition and time to Harold Burbank, who's running for the Senate on the Green Party ticket. Now, there's a lot more to say about the bailout, but I'll summarize it. If they did it right, first they would comprehensively regulate this industry, because it was deregulation, taking the federal cop off the financial beat in Wall Street that started this. And you can thank Bill Clinton for this. He's the one who passed the Financial Deregulation Act in 1999, and then he made sure that the derivatives were not be regulated in 2000, working hand in glove with the Republicans. Comprehensive regulation. Now just think of the moment we lost here in the last week. Washington had Wall Street over a barrel. They would have had to agree to anything in order to get their $700 billion bailout. They would have had to agree to comprehensive regulation, to giving more power to shareholders to control the company they own and put those bosses out of business who tanked these companies. They would have had to agree to taxpayer equity. So if you, the taxpayer, are going to bail out some of these firms, you get stock warrants in the U.S. Treasury, and if the firms make a profit, you get paid back. That's what happened in the Chrysler bailout. Taxpayers made $400 million. Those stock warrants went up when Iacocca turned Chrysler around. They would have had to accept greater disclosure. And they would have had to accept the reinstatement of the Glass-Steagall Act that would have prevented the conflicts of interest that led to deceiving investors. And above all, they would have had to accept a securities derivative speculation tax, which would have required these Wall Street crooks and speculators and swindlers with other people's money, worker pension money, for example, would have required them to pay for their own bailout. Instead, notwithstanding that Washington had Wall Street over a barrel, Wall Street opened the barrel, Wall Street opened the barrel, stuffed Washington in the barrel, and then rolled Washington. That's how bad it was. And let me show you how easy it would have been. This year, there are $500 trillion in security derivative transactions. That's buying and selling these puts, options, straddles, all these crazy instruments that tank so much of people's financial retirements and savings. 1/10% of that 500 trillion tax, 1/10% is $500 billion every year. And that would have paid for the bailout. So when Chris Dodd and the hermaphrodite of American politics, Senator Joe Lieberman, come back home, you got some questions. And when Chris comes back here to the district, Murphy, you've got some tough questions to ask him. So I put out a release yesterday urging taxpayers to summon these members of Congress, they're coming back home to get your vote, to public auditoriums, a lot of high school auditoriums, a lot of seats, and explain themselves. And in that auditorium, there'll be people who can tear aside the phony explanations and get at the truth when their turn to ask questions comes. How many people would like to do that?